It was a crisp, clear evening in the city of Fulton, and Captain Lisa Moore was on her way home from a long day at the station. As she drove down familiar streets, she reflected on the day. A series of routine meetings, some policy reviews, and a heartening moment with a young recruit who had expressed interest in community policing. She was respected and well-loved within the Fulton Police Department, known for her calm demeanor and her firm commitment to justice. She was, in many ways, the model officer, not just because of her dedication, but because she treated every case, every call, and every citizen with unwavering respect. But as she turned down Maple Avenue, that reputation, hard-earned over years, was about to be put to the ultimate test. Behind her, flashing lights appeared out of nowhere, piercing the quiet of the night with an unexpected urgency. Lisa glanced in her rearview mirror and felt her pulse quicken. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any laws. This was her community, and she knew these streets better than anyone. Pulling over to the side, she waited, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, heart racing but composed. Moments later, a tall figure approached her window. The officer wore a stern expression, his gaze narrowed as he sized her up. She recognized him instantly. Officer Paul Grant was known in the department for his rigorous approach, though some would say he walked the line between diligent and overzealous. It was no secret that he'd rubbed colleagues the wrong way on more than one occasion, but complaints about his conduct had a way of disappearing. "License and registration," he barked, without any greeting or explanation for why she'd been pulled over. Lisa looked up at him calmly, handing over her documents without a word. She had learned, after years in uniform, that silence could be a powerful tool. But Officer Grant seemed determined to prod her into a reaction. He eyed her license, his brows furrowing as he glanced at the car's interior, a well-kept vehicle with nothing out of the ordinary. For a moment, his eyes lingered on her badge, partially visible from her wallet, as she reached into the glove compartment for her registration. His face twitched, a hint of realization perhaps, but he quickly masked it with a curt nod. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom," he ordered, his voice clipped, betraying none of the recognition that should have been evident to anyone in their line of work. Lisa's mind raced. This was unusual, highly irregular for a routine stop, especially when he had clearly seen her badge. But she complied, getting out of the car slowly, her posture relaxed but alert. Grant gestured for her to move to the side, and she felt the sting of his scrutiny, the weight of judgment behind his gaze. He didn't recognize her, or perhaps he didn't want to. "Is there a reason you pulled me over?" she asked, her voice level, devoid of the irritation that might have laced her words had she been anyone else. Grant smirked, his eyes gleaming with a challenge. "We've had some reports of suspicious vehicles in the area," he said, his tone layered with implication, as if he expected her to say more, to betray something hidden in the guise of innocence. Lisa met his stare, feeling the absurdity of the situation sink in. Her car was registered in her name, her credentials were visible, and he had no grounds to escalate this beyond a polite exchange. And yet, here they were, locked in a silent standoff on the side of the road. Grant took his time, looking over her car with an exaggerated thoroughness, his flashlight sweeping across seats and consoles, looking for a reason to justify his actions. To anyone else, it might have seemed routine, but Lisa knew this was anything but. Her record was spotless, and in all her years as a captain, she'd never had reason to distrust one of her own. Until now. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the quiet of the night broken only by the hum of his flashlight as he inspected her vehicle inch by inch. She watched him, her patience thinning, but her composure steady. She couldn't afford to let her emotions betray her. She knew exactly how it would look, and she wasn't about to give him any ammunition. Finally, Grant straightened up, his mouth set in a hard line as he closed her car door with a snap. He walked back to her, standing too close, as if trying to assert some unspoken dominance. "Mind telling me what you're doing driving a car like this in this neighborhood?" he asked, his tone laced with thinly veiled suspicion. Lisa felt her patience strain, but she answered calmly, "I'm on my way home, Officer Grant. I live just a few blocks from here." She let the words sink in, watched as a flicker of recognition crossed his face, though he quickly masked it with indifference. For a brief, silent moment, she considered revealing her rank, reminding him of his place. But something stopped her. Instead, she stood there, waiting, allowing him to make the next move. And just as she expected, he did. "I'm going to need you to open the trunk," he said, his voice full of authority but lacking any real justification. It was clear he was reaching, desperate to find something, anything, that would validate his actions. Without a word, Lisa walked over, unlocked the trunk, and stepped back, folding her arms as he began rummaging through the few items inside. And then he froze. There, tucked neatly inside a folder, were her credentials, her captain's badge, and a formal letter on department letterhead from the chief himself, a reminder for an upcoming high-level meeting. Grant's face went pale, his hands faltering as he held the folder, realization dawning upon him with a force that left him visibly shaken. His eyes darted back to her, a mix of shock and disbelief etched across his face. She watched him, her expression unreadable, waiting for him to process the reality that was sinking in. "Captain Moore," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper, the weight of his mistake bearing down on him with crushing force. Lisa held his gaze, unflinching, the silent power of her position speaking louder than any reprimand she could have voiced. For a moment, she saw vulnerability in his eyes, a crack in the armor he had worn with such certainty. And then, as swiftly as the moment had arrived, it was gone, replaced by a mask of defensiveness, a refusal to admit fault. "Is there a problem, Officer Grant?" she asked, her voice carrying an edge that left no room for denial. Grant cleared his throat, stumbling over his words as he scrambled to salvage the remnants of his authority. "No, ma'am. Just a routine check." But the damage was done. In that instant, the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, leaving Grant exposed, vulnerable in a way he had never anticipated. He handed her the folder, his hands trembling slightly, and she took it, her gaze unwavering. "Next time," she said quietly, "maybe you should look a little closer before you jump to conclusions." With that, she stepped back into her car, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Grant standing alone on the roadside, grappling with the consequences of his actions. As she drove off, Lisa felt a surge of emotions: anger, disappointment, but most of all, a renewed sense of purpose. She knew this wasn't over. The questions would come, and she would be ready. Tonight, she had been reminded of a truth she'd long known but had hoped was fading: that sometimes, even within the ranks of those sworn to serve, the battle for justice was far from won. As Lisa drove away, the encounter weighed heavily on her mind. She felt the simmering tension that came from confronting something ugly and unwelcome, something she had hoped to never encounter from within the department. She'd seen and heard about implicit biases, but experiencing it firsthand from one of her own officers was a bitter pill to swallow. She thought back to Grant's face as he realized who she was, a mixture of fear, shame, and stubborn pride. But in that fleeting moment, he'd given away so much about himself, things she knew now would be impossible to ignore. The next morning, Lisa arrived at the precinct with her usual composure, but this time, there was a steely determination beneath the calm exterior. She greeted her colleagues with a nod, her expression neutral but focused. She had a task ahead, and it was one she knew wouldn't be easy. As she walked toward her office, she noticed Grant lingering near the break room, his gaze darting around, avoiding eye contact. It was clear that he hadn't expected her to come in so soon, or perhaps hadn't expected her to come in at all after their encounter. She entered her office and closed the door, taking a moment to collect her thoughts. Lisa had spent her career fostering an environment where officers were encouraged to treat every citizen with respect and dignity, and she had always made a point of leading by example. But now, with Grant's behavior still fresh in her mind, she knew it was time to take action. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she reached Chief Walker's number. She hesitated for a brief second, knowing that this call would set off a chain of events that could potentially shake the precinct to its core. But the hesitation was fleeting, replaced by the firm resolve she'd built over years of standing for what was right. "Chief Walker, it's Lisa," she said as he picked up. "There's something I need to discuss with you regarding one of our officers. It's serious." The chief's voice was calm but slightly wary. He had worked with Lisa long enough to know she didn't call lightly, especially not about something she could handle on her own. "Come by my office," he said simply. Within minutes, Lisa found herself sitting across from the chief, recounting the previous night's events with meticulous detail. She explained how Grant's demeanor had shifted when he'd realized her rank, how he'd spoken to her with barely concealed disdain until he understood who she was. Chief Walker listened in silence, his brows knitting together as the story unfolded. When she finished, he exhaled, his expression one of resignation mixed with frustration. "Lisa, this isn't the first time we've had concerns about Grant," he admitted, his voice low. "We've had complaints, minor things mostly, nothing concrete enough to take formal action, but this might be the tipping point." Lisa felt a pang of disappointment, realizing that her experience wasn't unique. It was part of a larger, ongoing issue that had been allowed to simmer unchecked. "So we've just been waiting for him to cross a line?" she asked, unable to keep the edge of frustration out of her voice. Walker met her gaze, his eyes filled with an understanding that only years in the service could bring. "It's complicated, Lisa. You know how it is. Sometimes we don't have the resources or the evidence. But with this, with you bringing it forward, we have something concrete. And we'll address it." There was a pause as the weight of the situation settled between them, each understanding the gravity of what this could mean for both the department and for Grant. Lisa knew that reporting him would stir tension among officers, especially those who saw Grant as an ally or even a friend. But she also knew that doing nothing would be a betrayal of her values and the oath she'd taken when she put on the uniform. She nodded, feeling a sense of resolve solidify within her. "Then we move forward," she said, her voice steady. "But I want to be a part of this process. I need to know that this won't be swept under the rug." Walker assured her that she would be kept informed and that they would launch a formal inquiry into Grant's behavior. As she left his office, Lisa knew there was no going back. She had crossed a line herself, a line that now held her in a place of accountability not only to herself, but to the community she served. Over the following days, tension buzzed in the air at the precinct. Word of the investigation spread quickly, and whispers followed Lisa as she walked the hallways. Some officers looked at her with respect, admiration even, for having the courage to take a stand. But others gave her cold, assessing glances, as if questioning her loyalty. Grant himself avoided her, his face tight with the strain of knowing he was under scrutiny, his usual swagger noticeably absent. She could feel the resentment brewing, a toxic cloud that hinted at the unspoken divisions within the precinct. But Lisa was no stranger to adversity. She focused on her work, maintaining the same standards she always had, setting an example through her actions and integrity. She knew this was only the beginning, that the inquiry would uncover things that people had kept hidden, perhaps for years. And as much as she wanted justice, she braced herself for the backlash that would inevitably follow. A week into the investigation, Lisa was called into a meeting with the internal affairs team, who had been tasked with handling the case. They presented her with files, documenting complaints that had been buried or overlooked, detailing incidents where Grant had allegedly abused his authority. Each account was a small piece of a larger, troubling pattern, and with every new revelation, Lisa's resolve hardened. She realized that her experience had only been the tip of the iceberg, a glimpse into a deeper issue that had festered unchecked. Just as the investigation was gaining momentum, an unexpected twist occurred. One of Grant's former partners, Officer Alex Ruse, came forward, requesting to speak to Lisa in private. She met him in her office, watching as he shifted uncomfortably, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked tired, worn down by something more than just a long shift. "I've been meaning to say something for a long time, Captain," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "Grant and we've had some incidents, times where he crossed the line, but I never said anything. I kept my head down, thought it wasn't my business, but I can't stay silent anymore." He went on to recount specific instances where Grant had acted out of line, using his badge as a weapon rather than a shield. His account added weight to the mounting evidence, and Lisa felt a mix of anger and sadness as she listened. She thanked him, understanding the courage it took to come forward, especially in a culture that often valued loyalty over accountability. With Ruiz's statement, the case against Grant solidified, and Lisa knew the next steps would be critical. As the inquiry continued, more officers began to speak up, sharing stories of incidents they'd witnessed or experienced, each account painting a clearer picture of a man who had used his position to mask his biases. The revelations rippled through the precinct, creating an atmosphere charged with both tension and a newfound sense of hope. For some, it was a reckoning, a chance to finally address issues that had long been ignored. But for others, it was a bitter pill, a blow to the unspoken bonds of loyalty that they believed defined the force. Through it all, Lisa remained steady, her resolve unwavering even as the backlash grew. She had made a choice, one that had cost her some friends and allies, but had given her a newfound respect among those who valued integrity. And as the inquiry drew to a close, she knew that her actions would leave a lasting impact, not just on Grant's career, but on the department as a whole. The news of Grant's investigation hit the precinct like a storm, stirring up emotions and dividing loyalties within the ranks. Lisa could feel the shift in the air whenever she walked into a room. Conversations quieted, heads turned away, and the familiar camaraderie she once shared with her fellow officers now felt distant, strained. But this wasn't about popularity or fitting in. It was about something much deeper, standing up for what was right. She had known this would happen, prepared herself for the isolation, but she hadn't fully anticipated how unsettling it would feel to suddenly be an outsider among people she once trusted. Lisa pushed forward, her focus on the task at hand. Each day brought new revelations about Grant's past, with testimonies from officers, complaints from citizens, and reports of misconduct surfacing one after another. These weren't minor missteps or misunderstandings. They painted a picture of a man who had repeatedly crossed lines, exploiting his power while hiding behind his badge. Yet it wasn't just the contents of the files that disturbed her. It was the knowledge that so many people had known, yet no one had acted until now. The weight of the systemic silence felt crushing, as if every page in those reports was another layer of complicity that stretched back years. One afternoon, Lisa was called to a briefing with Chief Walker and the Internal Affairs team to discuss the scope of the investigation. The meeting room was quiet, the usual hum of banter absent, replaced by a tense silence. Chief Walker looked exhausted, the lines on his face deepened by the strain of dealing with a scandal that threatened to undo years of hard work. He addressed the team, his tone somber. "We're dealing with a situation that goes beyond one officer's misconduct," he began, his gaze resting on Lisa. "This is a breach of trust, a stain on our reputation. We need to be thorough. We need to make sure this is resolved in a way that restores the community's faith in us." As he spoke, Lisa scanned the room, taking in the faces of her colleagues. Some were attentive, nodding along, while others sat stiffly, arms crossed, faces hardened with resentment. A few she knew well, officers she had shared shifts with, celebrated promotions alongside, even attended family gatherings. And now she could see the silent judgment in their eyes, the accusation that she was the reason they were all under scrutiny. It stung, but she held her head high, knowing that she couldn't let their resentment sway her. This wasn't about her. It was about holding the department accountable. As the meeting concluded, Lisa lingered, wanting a word with Chief Walker. "Chief," she began cautiously, I think we need to involve the community in this process. They need to know we're taking this seriously, and we need to hear from them too. If this investigation is going to bring any real change, we need transparency." Walker's expression softened, a glint of respect in his eyes. He nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, Lisa. We've been keeping things too closed off. Maybe that's been part of the problem all along. I'll work on organizing a town hall meeting. It won't be easy, but I think you're right. It's time we let people see what's happening inside these walls." The announcement of the town hall meeting spread quickly, igniting conversations and speculations. Officers were tense, some defensive, others quietly supportive, yet all on edge about what it might mean for their futures. The tension followed Lisa wherever she went, a palpable weight that settled over every interaction. Some of her closest colleagues had started keeping their distance, their eyes downcast or their words curt, unwilling or unable to reconcile the fact that she was the catalyst for this upheaval. But she remained resolute. Change was never comfortable, and if that meant standing alone, she would do it. The night of the town hall arrived, and the precinct was packed. Members of the community filled the rows, many faces unfamiliar to Lisa, but others known well from years of neighborhood watch meetings, local events, and even casual encounters in grocery stores and parks. They were everyday citizens, parents, teachers, business owners, people who had placed their trust in the department, some now looking at her with expressions of betrayal, others with admiration. She could feel the mix of emotions radiating from the crowd: frustration, hope, skepticism, anger, and something she hadn't expected: gratitude. Chief Walker opened the meeting with a brief address, acknowledging the community's concerns and affirming their commitment to transparency. He explained the investigation, ensuring everyone understood that it was not just about one officer but about addressing the broader issues that had allowed misconduct to go unchecked. Then he invited Lisa to speak, her role in initiating the investigation already well known through word of mouth and a few determined local journalists who had latched onto the story. Taking a deep breath, Lisa stepped up to the podium, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. She could see Grant in the back, his posture rigid, his face a mask of simmering resentment. She knew he didn't want to be here, forced into this public accountability, but he was out of options. She also saw her supporters, friends, family, officers who had quietly commended her bravery but couldn't openly side with her. She felt the weight of all their expectations and the burden of representing the department in a moment of vulnerability. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know this investigation has stirred a lot of feelings: anger, disappointment, confusion. I understand because I feel them too. I love this community. I chose to serve it, to protect it, because I believe in justice, and I believe in the integrity of our police force. But sometimes we have to confront hard truths, especially when they're close to home." The audience was silent, listening intently as she continued. "This investigation is not just about one officer's actions. It's about making sure that everyone in this community feels safe and respected, regardless of who they are or where they come from. We're committed to rooting out the biases and abuses that have no place in our department. I know this won't fix things overnight, but it's a start. And I promise you, we're not just here to say the right words. We're here to make things right." As she finished, a wave of applause rippled through the room. Hesitant at first, but building in strength, she felt a sense of relief mingled with the tension, a recognition that while not everyone might agree with her, they respected her commitment. Grant, however, remained unmoved, his expression dark, lips pressed into a thin line as he avoided her gaze. After the meeting, a few community members approached Lisa to thank her, their words of encouragement bolstering her spirits. But as she prepared to leave, she found herself face to face with Officer Ruse, Grant's former partner who had spoken to her in private. His expression was pained, conflicted. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry, Captain," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I should have spoken up sooner. I thought I was protecting the team, but all I did was protect the wrong people." Lisa placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's not too late, Ruiz. What matters is that you're standing up now. That takes courage." He nodded, visibly relieved, and Lisa felt a renewed sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this investigation could be the beginning of real change. As she drove home that night, exhausted but at peace, Lisa realized that she had crossed another threshold. She had challenged not only her department, but also herself, facing down doubts and fears that had lingered in her heart for far too long. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she knew now that she had the strength to see it through, no matter the cost. She was no longer just a captain. She had become something more, an agent of change, a voice for justice, and a leader her community could trust. The following week, the precinct felt like it was under siege. Every day brought new developments in the investigation, as more of Grant's past actions came to light. Whispers of his disciplinary record, which had previously been hidden away, began circulating among officers. The tension was thick, and Lisa could sense the growing discomfort among her colleagues. Some cast wary glances in her direction, as though her presence alone was a reminder of the truth that many were not yet ready to face. Others avoided her altogether, perhaps fearful of being associated with her stance. She walked through the halls with her head held high, but each step felt like she was walking through quicksand, the weight of isolation pressing down on her. It was no longer just her versus Grant. It felt as if she were challenging an entire system that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked. That Thursday, she received a surprising call from a reporter, Jordan Kane, an old acquaintance from her days patrolling the city's tougher neighborhoods. Jordan had a reputation for covering stories that many other reporters wouldn't touch, stories that exposed injustice and demanded accountability. He was also known for being tenacious, once tracking down the details of a local scandal that had ultimately led to a high-ranking official's resignation. He had heard about the investigation and wanted her side of the story. "Captain Moore." He greeted her, his voice steady and professional, but with a hint of familiarity. "I know this might be a delicate time, but the community deserves to know what's really happening in the precinct. They need to hear it from someone they trust." Lisa hesitated, understanding the weight of his words. Speaking to the press could add more fuel to an already blazing fire, yet she also knew that staying silent allowed others to shape the narrative. She thought back to the town hall, the faces of those who had looked to her for answers, for hope that things would change. After a moment's pause, she agreed to meet Jordan at a small cafe just outside town, away from prying eyes. When she arrived, Jordan was already there, a notebook and recorder on the table, his usual calm but intense expression on his face. As she sat down, he gave her a nod of encouragement. "Thanks for meeting with me, Lisa. I know this isn't easy." They talked for nearly an hour, Jordan asking probing questions, and Lisa answering with honesty and a guarded precision. She revealed her concerns about Grant's pattern of behavior, the failure of the department to address past complaints, and her hope that this investigation would be the beginning of true reform. "This isn't just about one man," she emphasized. "It's about making sure that the values we preach are actually upheld within our ranks. The community deserves officers who live up to the ideals we've sworn to protect." Jordan listened intently, scribbling notes and nodding occasionally. When she finished, he looked her in the eye, a glint of admiration evident. "You're doing something most people wouldn't have the courage to do, Lisa. This is going to shake things up, but people need to hear it." The article was published the next day, a bold front-page piece that detailed the investigation and included quotes from Lisa, emphasizing her commitment to integrity and accountability. The headline read, "Captain Stands Up Against Corruption, a Precinct Divided." Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Calls flooded the station, and the public response was swift and impassioned. While many supported her, there were just as many who accused her of betraying her colleagues, airing their dirty laundry for all to see. Some even speculated that her motivations were personal, suggesting that she was seeking publicity or advancement at the expense of the department's reputation. The backlash within the precinct was immediate. Officers who had once greeted her with smiles and friendly banter now barely acknowledged her presence. Lisa had expected some resistance, but the scale of it was daunting. She became a pariah in her own workplace, a constant reminder of the investigation that had cast a shadow over everyone's careers. She overheard whispered conversations, felt the accusatory stares, and sensed the resentment growing around her like a storm cloud. One evening, as she was packing up to leave, Officer Ruiz appeared at her door, looking uneasy. "Captain, a few of us were talking. They're saying you're making us look bad, that you're only doing this to tear us down," he said, his voice conflicted. Lisa looked at him, understanding the pain and confusion in his eyes. She had known Ruiz for years, respected him as an officer, and considered him a friend. "Alex, you know this isn't about tearing anyone down. This is about building something better. If we ignore these problems, we're failing the very people we swore to protect. This isn't a personal vendetta. It's about doing the right thing." Ruiz sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, Captain. But people, they're scared. They're angry. They think that once this investigation is over, we'll all be judged for Grant's actions." Lisa nodded, understanding his fears. "They might. But we have to ask ourselves if we're willing to accept that judgment, knowing that we're taking a step toward real change. I'm not asking anyone to choose sides. I'm just asking people to remember why they joined this force in the first place." As Ruiz left, she felt a small sense of relief. At least some of her colleagues still understood her motives, even if they didn't openly support her. But the isolation and tension were taking their toll. She found herself second-guessing her decisions, wondering if she had the strength to keep pushing forward. Yet every time those doubts surfaced, she remembered the faces of those community members at the town hall, their hope, their need for justice. She reminded herself that this was bigger than her, bigger than any one officer. As the investigation continued, another unexpected twist emerged. A former recruit who had left the precinct a few years earlier came forward with allegations against Grant. He claimed that during his training, Grant had made derogatory comments about certain neighborhoods and minority groups, suggesting that they required a different kind of policing. The recruit, who had left the force disillusioned, provided detailed accounts of Grant's behavior, bolstering the case against him. With this new testimony, Internal Affairs had more than enough evidence to take decisive action. Grant was suspended pending further investigation, his badge and gun taken, and he was placed on administrative leave. The news spread quickly, and though Lisa felt a sense of relief, she also felt the weight of what this decision would mean for the department. She knew that while justice had been served, the impact would be long-lasting, reshaping relationships, reputations, and the very culture of the precinct. In the days following Grant's suspension, Lisa found herself reflecting deeply on the journey she had undertaken. She had always believed in the principles of justice, fairness, and accountability, but she had never imagined how isolating it would be to stand by those principles in the face of such fierce opposition. She had seen firsthand how loyalty, unchecked, could turn toxic, binding people to silence rather than truth. And yet, despite the challenges, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was the path she had chosen, and it was a path worth walking, even if she had to walk it alone. But she wasn't entirely alone. A small group of officers began to approach her privately, thanking her for her courage, expressing support for what she was doing. These were officers who, like her, wanted to see a better, stronger department, one where integrity wasn't just a word, but a guiding principle. Their support was quiet but steady, a reminder that change, while slow, was happening. The community, too, began to rally around her, organizing events to show their appreciation and advocating for greater oversight in local policing. The story had become bigger than the investigation. It had become a symbol of the community's demand for justice and accountability. People who had once felt voiceless now saw that their concerns were valid, that there were officers willing to stand with them, rather than above them. One evening, as she left the precinct, Lisa looked out over the city, feeling a sense of accomplishment tempered with the awareness of the road that still lay ahead. She knew this was only the beginning, that the work to rebuild trust would take time, patience, and more courage than she had ever thought possible. But she was ready. This fight had shown her what true leadership looked like, not in the loyalty of silence, but in the courage to stand, even if it meant standing alone. The days following Grant's suspension brought a wave of both relief and resistance, each day carrying its own turbulence as the precinct adjusted to the fallout. For Lisa, the relief was tempered by the knowledge that her work was far from over. With Grant now officially removed from active duty, the spotlight fell directly on her, as she'd become the unwitting symbol of change within the department. To her supporters, she was a beacon of hope and a sign that someone was willing to challenge the system. To her detractors, however, she was a threat, someone who had betrayed the unspoken code of silence that bound officers together. The backlash had become fierce and increasingly personal. Lisa's inbox overflowed with anonymous messages, some of them supportive, but many were filled with accusations and insults. She'd known this would happen. She had prepared herself for it. But there was no training that could shield her from the sting of each harsh word. Her closest friends within the precinct were now distant, and the quiet tension had turned into open hostility from certain corners. Some officers would deliberately turn their backs when she walked by, muttering under their breath as she passed. Others made no effort to hide their disdain, casting cold, challenging looks as if daring her to confront them. One morning, as she sat in her office preparing a report, she received a call from Chief Walker, asking her to attend a closed-door meeting with the city council and a few prominent community leaders. The council had been following the investigation closely, and with growing pressure from the public, they were eager to address not only Grant's case, but the broader implications for the department. Lisa sensed the importance of this meeting. This was her chance to advocate for deeper changes that could prevent someone like Grant from slipping through the cracks again. The meeting took place in a modest conference room at City Hall. The council members sat in a semicircle, their expressions a mixture of seriousness and curiosity, while community leaders filled the other seats, including ministers, local activists, and even a few concerned citizens who had taken up the cause. Chief Walker was there as well, his face impassive but tense. Lisa felt the weight of their collective gaze, the high expectations that her actions had set. She had come this far, and she knew that to back down now would undermine everything she had fought for. One council member, Councilwoman Green, addressed her directly. "Captain Moore, we understand that you've taken a significant stand against misconduct within your precinct, and the community appreciates your courage. However, we need to understand how this could have happened in the first place. We want to know what safeguards failed and how we can ensure they're reinforced moving forward." Lisa took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Councilwoman Green, I believe this isn't simply about one officer's misconduct, but about a culture that sometimes places loyalty above accountability. For years, there have been complaints, red flags, but they were ignored or minimized. Some officers felt they couldn't speak up, either out of fear of repercussions or because they believed it wouldn't make a difference. We need structural changes that empower officers to come forward without fearing backlash and systems that ensure every complaint is thoroughly investigated." As she spoke, she could feel the intensity of the room shift. Heads nodded, murmurs of agreement passed among the community leaders. She explained her vision for mandatory training sessions focused on ethical policing, on the importance of open dialogues between officers and the communities they served. But her proposals went beyond training. She suggested an independent review board that could oversee internal investigations to ensure that cases weren't quietly swept under the rug, especially cases that involved biases or abuse of power. Chief Walker listened in silence, but Lisa could tell he was absorbing her words with a mixture of pride and apprehension. Her proposals were bold, even controversial, but they were exactly what the community needed to hear. When she finished, there was a brief silence, a moment in which the gravity of her suggestions seemed to sink in. Councilwoman Green broke the quiet, her tone approving but cautious. "Captain Moore, your suggestions are ambitious, and I believe you've made a compelling case. But we'll need support from within the department as well. Do you think the precinct is ready for this kind of change?" Lisa knew this was the pivotal question. The precinct was divided. That much was certain, and while she had supporters, there were many who resented her for challenging the status quo. She glanced at Chief Walker, then back at the council, her resolve unshaken. "Change is never easy, Councilwoman. There will be resistance, but I believe that we're at a tipping point. If we can set an example here, we have the potential to transform not just our precinct, but the broader relationship between law enforcement and the community. We can rebuild trust, but only if we commit fully." After the meeting, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, tempered with the sobering realization that the real work was just beginning. Her proposals would require backing not only from the council but from her colleagues, many of whom still viewed her actions as a betrayal. She knew she'd have to face them, to persuade them to see beyond their anger, to understand that what she was fighting for was a future in which they could all be proud to serve. But as she walked through the halls of the precinct that afternoon, she couldn't help but feel the cold stares of officers who saw her as an adversary rather than an ally. That evening, as she sat alone in her small apartment, exhausted from the emotional toll of the day, her phone rang. It was Jordan Kane, the reporter who had interviewed her earlier. His voice was animated, eager. "Lisa, I just wanted to let you know. There's been a huge response to the article. People are rallying behind you. And I've been contacted by several former officers who left the precinct because of similar issues. They're willing to come forward, to share their experiences. This could really be something big." Hearing his words, Lisa felt a mixture of hope and trepidation. More voices could lend strength to her cause, but it could also mean dragging up more painful stories, exposing deeper wounds within the department. She thanked him, knowing that the support of former officers could lend credibility to her efforts, but also knowing it would likely deepen the divide within the precinct. The following day, Jordan's article featuring the testimonies of former officers went live, sparking even greater interest and attention. The article detailed incidents of bias and misconduct, recounting experiences eerily similar to what she had uncovered about Grant. This new wave of exposure added weight to the push for reform, and it became clear that this investigation had outgrown its initial scope. Community members began gathering outside the precinct, holding signs that read "Justice Within" and "Accountability for All." The pressure was mounting, not just on Grant, but on the entire department to address the systemic issues that had been allowed to fester. As the public pressure grew, Chief Walker called an emergency meeting with Lisa and several other high-ranking officers, some of whom had been skeptical of her actions from the start. The room was tense, a mixture of allies and adversaries seated around the table, their expressions hard, guarded. Chief Walker addressed them all, his tone serious. "We're at a crossroads. The community has made it clear that they demand change, and we need to decide if we're going to rise to meet that demand or let this department be torn apart by inaction." One of the lieutenants, a senior officer who had always prided himself on the tradition of the force, spoke up. "With all due respect, Chief, Captain Moore's actions have put us in a difficult position. Our officers feel betrayed. We're being portrayed as villains when we've spent our lives protecting this community." Lisa could feel the anger in his words, but she met his gaze without flinching. "Lieutenant, this isn't about portraying anyone as villains. It's about accountability. It's about making sure we're living up to the standards we set for ourselves. The community trusts us to protect them, and that trust has been broken. Ignoring these issues won't make them go away. It'll only make them worse." The room fell silent, and Lisa could see the flicker of uncertainty in the lieutenant's eyes. She knew that he, like many of her colleagues, felt torn between loyalty to the force and the undeniable need for change. Finally, Chief Walker spoke, his voice filled with resolve. "Lisa's right. We need to lead by example, not cling to the past. This department has a duty to serve with integrity, and that means holding ourselves accountable. As the meeting concluded, Lisa felt a shift, a tentative but undeniable movement toward acceptance. It wasn't full support, but it was a start, a willingness to consider that change was not the enemy, but the path forward. She left the room with a sense of cautious optimism, knowing that while the road ahead would be challenging, there was hope. Over the next few weeks, the department began to implement the first stages of the reforms Lisa had proposed. Training programs were scheduled, community forums were planned, and the independent review board began taking shape. The process was slow, fraught with resistance and tension, but each step was a victory, a reminder that progress was possible. And as Lisa walked through the precinct, the icy stares became fewer, replaced by nods of respect, of acknowledgement, even from those who had once viewed her as a traitor. She knew that not everyone would ever fully support her, but that wasn't why she had taken this stand. She had done it for the community, for the officers who believed in a better future, and for herself. Looking back on the journey, she realized that this fight had changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She had become not only a leader but a symbol of resilience and integrity. And as she left the precinct that day, hearing in the months that followed, the precinct underwent a transformation that few had anticipated. The initial reforms Lisa had advocated for were only the beginning. The independent review board was fully operational, and its existence marked a significant shift in how complaints were handled. No longer would concerns be buried beneath layers of bureaucracy. Now, every report would be heard, and every case would be given the full weight of scrutiny it deserved. There was a sense of cautious optimism among some officers, while others remained skeptical, convinced that the changes were a temporary wave that would eventually recede. Lisa herself had become somewhat of a reluctant hero, both within the community and beyond. News outlets from neighboring cities picked up her story, showcasing her as a symbol of accountability in law enforcement. She received letters and messages from people she'd never met, some thanking her, others challenging her, and a few offering their own stories of struggles against similar forces of resistance in their communities. She read each letter carefully, feeling the weight of her actions ripple out far beyond the walls of her precinct. But not everyone was convinced that these changes were for the best. A faction within the department continued to see her as a disruption, a force that had destabilized the unity they believed was essential to their work. Among them was Lieutenant Rayleigh, who had openly criticized Lisa's actions from the beginning. Rayleigh was a veteran officer, deeply respected, but his loyalty to tradition often overshadowed his perspective on justice. He'd been part of the old guard for so long that change felt more like an attack than an evolution. Lisa's reforms, to him, felt like betrayal. One afternoon, Rayleigh confronted her in the precinct hallway. "I hope you're happy with what you've done, Captain," he said, his voice edged with bitterness. "You think this is progress, but all you've done is create division. We were a team, and you turned us against each other." Lisa met his gaze, unwavering. She had known this moment would come, the final confrontation with someone who embodied the resistance to her cause. "Lieutenant, I didn't create division. I brought to light the divisions that already existed. Ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. It only lets them grow, unchecked. If we're going to call ourselves protectors of the community, we have to hold ourselves to the same standards we hold everyone else to." Rayleigh shook his head, his eyes dark with frustration. "This job isn't about idealism, Captain. It's about loyalty. You don't seem to understand that." Lisa took a breath, holding her ground. "I understand loyalty, Lieutenant. But loyalty to what? To whom? I'm loyal to the people we serve, and to the principles that brought me here in the first place. If you think that means betraying our team, then maybe it's time to redefine what it means to be a team." The tension between them was palpable, but Rayleigh eventually stepped back, his face a mixture of defeat and anger. It was a confrontation that, while uncomfortable, was necessary. Lisa knew that not everyone would embrace the changes she'd set in motion, but she also knew that leadership wasn't about making everyone comfortable. It was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. As the weeks passed, the community began to see the impact of Lisa's actions in more tangible ways. Officers were now required to attend monthly community forums, where they would listen directly to residents' concerns and answer questions about policing practices. At first, these meetings were tense, filled with suspicion and skepticism. But as officers began to interact with the community on a more personal level, something remarkable began to happen. The community members who had once viewed the police with distrust started to see the faces behind the badges. And for the officers, the shift was equally transformative. They were no longer just enforcers, but members of a broader community, bound by shared goals and mutual respect. One evening, during one of these forums, an elderly woman named Mrs. Harris stood up and shared her story. She had lived in the neighborhood for over 50 years and had witnessed countless interactions between the police and her community. "I've seen good officers come and go," she said, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "But I've also seen those who abused their power, who treated us like we didn't belong in our own neighborhood. Captain Moore, you've done something I never thought I'd see. You made us believe that there could be justice, even within the system. For that, I thank you." The room erupted in applause, and Lisa felt a surge of gratitude and relief. Moments like this made every struggle, every late night, and every difficult confrontation worth it. This was the reason she had fought so hard, why she had endured the backlash and isolation. The community was starting to heal, and in turn, so was the precinct. Her journey, however, wasn't without its personal toll. Lisa had spent so much of herself in the pursuit of justice that she sometimes found herself wondering who she was outside of the uniform. The long hours, the strain of leadership, and the isolation had taken their toll on her relationships and her sense of self. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, she realized that she hadn't taken a day off in months, hadn't allowed herself to rest. Her entire life had become centered around the department and the changes she was implementing. It was then that her younger sister, Maya, came to visit. Maya had been one of her biggest supporters, but she had also been her fiercest critic, challenging Lisa to remember her own needs amidst the drive to make a difference. "You've done amazing things, Lisa," Maya said gently as they sat in the living room. "But you're only human. You need to take care of yourself too. The department will still be there tomorrow. Your work isn't going to disappear because you take a moment to breathe." Lisa smiled, realizing the truth in her sister's words. She had become so focused on the fight for justice that she had forgotten the importance of balance. She promised herself that she would start taking time for herself, to reconnect with her family, her friends, and the life she had set aside. It was a quiet but powerful revelation, one that allowed her to step back and see the broader picture, to recognize that true leadership meant also leading herself with the same compassion she showed others. The precinct continued to evolve, and though there were still those who resisted the changes, a new generation of officers began to rise, inspired by Lisa's courage. They saw her not as a disruptor, but as a mentor, someone who had shown them that integrity mattered more than blind loyalty. And as Lisa walked the halls of the precinct, she saw that the cold stares had softened, replaced by nods of respect, by greetings that hinted at understanding. She was no longer an outsider. She had become a cornerstone, a leader who had redefined what it meant to wear the badge. One day, as she prepared to leave the precinct after a long shift, she encountered Officer Ruiz in the hallway. He gave her a quiet nod, a gesture that carried a world of meaning. "Captain," he said, his voice steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for all of it, for standing up when the rest of us couldn't." Lisa met his gaze, feeling a profound sense of pride and humility. "Thank you, Ruiz. This isn't about me. It's about all of us. And we still have work to do." He nodded, understanding. "But at least now, we know we're on the right path." As she left the precinct that evening, Lisa looked back one last time, feeling the weight of everything she had accomplished and the challenges that still lay ahead. She knew that her journey wasn't over, that the path to justice and accountability was a long one, often fraught with setbacks and opposition. But she was ready. She had built a foundation, one that would allow future generations to stand on her shoulders, to continue the fight for a better, fairer system. And as she stepped out into the evening air, a sense of peace washed over her. She had found her purpose, not in the accolades or the recognition, but in the quiet resilience of standing for what was right, no matter the cost. Her legacy was no longer just hers. It belonged to the community, to the officers who believed in her vision, and to every person who dared to believe that change, though difficult, was possible.